Welcome to Inside the Game, episode 6, right here on OneSoccer and the OneSoccer digital platforms. And I am Gareth Wheeler. As our isolation comprehensive coverage continues, we spare no expense here at OneSoccer. Some new signage I made, especially for tonight's show. And you know, when you get a sign made, you know that you're legit. You know that you've actually made it. And this took a lot of work because there's a lot of letters in tonight's guest name. But that'll keep up behind me. It's like the Hollywood Hills sign in my very own background here in Toronto, Ontario. Um, the show has been going well. Welcome to those who are new. Welcome back to those as you continue to stay home and stay safe. And we're bringing you great guests each and every Tuesday and Thursday night right here across OneSoccer. We're pulling back the curtain, sharing the experiences of big names across the soccer industry. And we're digging a little deeper, tapping into the expertise and storytelling of some of our favorite people. As always, if you have a question for tonight's guest, you can hit me up, fire away on Twitter at Gareth Wheeler. You can use the chat right here on our YouTube channel. Chat away and I'll make sure that if it's a decent question, we'll get to it before we're done here tonight. My producer extraordinaire, David, he is all over it, so keep an eye out for that. A quick reminder, you can catch our OneSoccer Hangouts each and every Monday to Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and Happy Hour with a focus on the women's game each and every Wednesday evening across OneSoccer. So all right, tonight's guest, I'm thrilled to have him join because I know how much he misses me. He went from seeing me basically all the time to really not at all anymore, because 16 months ago, he took his talents all the way to Columbus, Ohio, a homecoming of sorts. The last decade was quite the ride for this man, and it's one riddled in success. He started his ascendancy within the game at MLS headquarters on Fifth Avenue in 2010, overseeing MLS contracts, salary budgets, and league-wide player development initiatives. He used that expertise to propel him into a general manager position in the hot seat at Toronto FC, where he took a club from a place of frustration and failure to really becoming one of, if not the model club in all of Major League Soccer. Marquee signings, proven commodities, and pieces for the future, they all came together, culminating in one of the most dominant eras in MLS history. He served as the architect of the best team, perhaps in Major League Soccer history in 2017, winning the treble with Toronto FC that really rewrote the record books. In 6 years in Toronto, he was part of 3 Canadian championships, winning the Voyageurs Cup, 2 Eastern Conference championships, a Supporters Shield, a CONCACAF Champions League final, and of course, an MLS Cup victory. All of this in his first job as a general manager, and all this before he's even hit the ripe age of 40. He set the bar so high, making the move back home in January of 2019, now presiding over a Trillium Cup rival in the Columbus Crew as president and general manager. And now he's in the midst of turning a young and very talented group into a legitimate MLS contending team, all the while overseeing an exciting new downtown stadium project that's bound to transform one of MLS, their original club teams. He's a model professional, a winner through and through, an encyclopedia of knowledge, and I'm thrilled to have him here tonight. I want to welcome Tim Bezbatchenko to Inside the Game. Tim, how are you?
I'm doing well, Wheels. I'm doing well. Quite the opening. I appreciate all those kind words. I have to say, I do miss you quite a bit. I miss not only your personality and your everything that you provide on a daily basis to the fans of Canadian soccer, but also your attire and your clothing choice. I thought maybe you would have your hat, your Mountie hat, at some point. You probably already brought it out. And
I'm just not sure if it can fit in the shot.
I'm episode 6, so I figured on the first episode you would have brought that one out. But no, but I'm really happy to be here. Obviously think of it's only it feels like yesterday that the transition from Toronto to Columbus happened, and obviously keep in touch with everyone at the club, dear friends, not just in the soccer side, but on the personal side. So happy to be joining you.
First off, everyone safe, everyone healthy right now. How are you and yours doing?
Yeah, we're doing well, thanks. Yeah, no, it's just everyone's in the same boat. It's incredible how even and equal the playing field it is. It is, at least for people who are fortunate to have spaces where they can go. And I think that's what's so terrifying about this virus is that there's everybody's situation in some ways is similar, but it's also different. And I'm lucky that the family so far, including my extended family, my parents and relatives, are all
Good.
healthy at this point. And just trying to figure out how to manage the day, get through the next day, because no one knows what the next week is going to entail, whether or not that's a soccer or in our personal lives. So, you know, in the states, each state is in a little bit of a different place. It's the same place probably up in terms of the provinces, but where Ohio is completely different from where New York is, which is different from where Washington state was, a month ago. And so we're just managing, but we're doing well. Thank you.
That's great to hear. By the way, in the intro, I think that's the first time I've ever called you President Tim.
Yeah,
Is that what you go by? Prez Bez, Bez the Prez, T Prez? What do you go by now?
just Tim, just Tim.
Because
Just Bez. I think is whatever you want to call me, Will.
because in Toronto, you weren't even just Tim up here, you were Tim B, because there was a very important Tim L, Tim Leiweke at the same time. So I'm glad that you could just be called Tim for once.
It was funny. I did an interview earlier in the week for the Columbus Sports Commission, and Linda Logan, who runs it, actually knows Tim Leiweke, grew up with him, and she knew that Tim Leiweke loved nicknames, and so she had me go through various nicknames and that I had with Tim. And for a while it was sort of Big Tim and Little Tim, and that didn't really fly over for either of us. And at the beginning, I was Harry Potter. Until you earn your stripes, you have a nickname. And then I knew the day I had made it, the day, I'm not sure you ever make it in Tim's book officially, but when he started calling me Tim or Bez, I feel like I'd turned a page in the Tim Leiweke novel.
See, Harry Potter, like that's to me is a compliment. I know you got the dark glasses, but I mean, he fought Voldemort. He ended up winning at the end of the day, providing that magic across the way, kind of like yourself, Tim. So maybe it was like a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that
Yeah,
manifested
yeah.
itself.
I have a 7-year-old son who's obsessed with it. But at the time, this is what 6, 7 years ago. 7 years
Oh,
ago,
cool.
I wasn't that well informed about the ways of Mr. Potter, but now I do know it in some ways. I can take it as a compliment. So
So before we kind of walk through your career, obviously as president and general manager of a professional sporting team, I mean, the work doesn't stop right now in isolation. Are you almost just as busy now as you typically are, or busy playing dad more often than playing president and general manager right
in some ways you're more busy. You have to try to be efficient with your time, because it's virtual call after virtual call, Zoom call after Zoom call. And I got to tell you, at the end of the day, they're exhausting. You have to. I think you have to focus a little bit more on the calls. I think you have to stay engaged. I think it's a little more challenging in terms of listening, obviously, with things going around in your home. But it is extremely busy. But just by the nature of it being virtual, it's probably not going to be as efficient and productive as in person in terms of getting things done. So, as I tell our staff, I'm extremely proud of them, and I would assume a lot of organizations are similar in that you got to put in 2, 3 times the amount of work in order to produce the same output. And so that's the challenging thing, is to keep things up and running, whether or not it's the team, the players doing their individual training sessions right now on their own, or it's on our business side in terms of thinking of creative digital content to put out on our website. Like everybody's full throttle, working really hard, and you really have to been pushing our staff to find a cadence, get into a routine. I think people started to get into routine of probably about 2, 3 weeks in,
now?
but
Sure.
really schedule time to take breaks and to take a bike ride with your family, or if you're allowed to go outside in your market, or to do those things. And I think that's been nice. At least here the weather has turned a little bit, and we're able to get outside and do those things.
What's probably made it a little bit more comfortable with you, all things considering, is that returning home back to Ohio, it's a homecoming of sorts for you, Tim. So things actually, in a roundabout way, have come full circle for you. And there's probably some comfort being in a familiar place now in Columbus. I mean, Toronto became home for you, and as was New York, but really, this is where some of your family roots are, isn't it?
It is. And to be honest, I never, my wife's from outside the Philadelphia area, and we had never really talked about moving back to Columbus in a serious way. I think obviously we knew that you don't get to pick and choose where you go in our industry. There's limited jobs, limited positions, and so we never thought it was going to be a possibility. And in all honesty, it had been away for 20 years, and it was only in the last couple of years did we see something that happened in Columbus, this sort of exponential growth and sort of a turnover in the culture that was happening here beyond soccer. This is just the industry and the city in of itself, that we felt like, okay, that Columbus is sort of coming into its own, and it's really it's a hot city right now. And I feel like a lot of the mid majors, the way that the city has grown, how it's been expensive, become expensive, like Toronto, New York, the Portlands, Austins, Columbuses, Nashville, these cities are becoming more attractive for people who are looking to settle down. So it is familiar place. It's changed quite a bit. We decided that we picked a place that was about 20 minutes from where I grew up. So there's still some distance from the parents, but it's nice that I get to see them on the weekends, and something I haven't been able to do for the past 20 years. But I got to be careful now with COVID. It's can't, trying to keep
Right.
that social distance from my parents. And but it has been fun to relearn the city, right? It's grown so much and it's gotten so big that it's just a different place than where I left it.
You grew up in a place called Westerville, which, like you said, about 20 minutes north of Columbus. You grew up playing. I know that there's some football players of some acclaim who are from Westerville, including former number one overall pick Yana Carter. A little bit of a draft bust, but we'll leave that alone. We're on NFL draft week here.
Forgot
But you
about
grew up
it.
playing the game. I mean, and Columbus was one of the original teams, and now we're celebrating 25 years of Major League Soccer. Could you ever imagine growing up as a kid playing the game close by that you would one day be the president and GM of the Columbus Crew?
No, and I tell this to people all the time. And if I'm talking to students, this league wasn't around until I was in high school. And so, in order to understand what the game was about, you're tuning in at it was actually called Worldwide Sports. Rob Stone had a show at 2 a.m. in the morning that I
Yeah.
used to tape on a VHS and watch it in the morning, or Rai, the Italian game on a Sunday you might be able to tune into. But I used to luckily there's a local Division III college, because Ohio State at the time didn't really have a strong program, called Ohio Wesleyan University, and Dr. Martin there is the winningest soccer coach in the United States across all divisions of collegiate soccer. And he had this camp that would attract all the D1 schools, coaches, and his whole theme was to paint the picture of the game. And through that sort of resources, when you start to think about what the game is global and what it means leading up into this launch of the league in '96, which at that time I was a freshman in high school, a first year, and we would meet in our parking lot at my high school, and we would drive down to the Shoe, which is where Ohio State football, obviously a famous venue, and we would watch the games together. And I really look back on those days to think about how the dream sort of shifted at that moment, because you could visualize what the game was going to be like 5-10 years down the road. I don't think I had thought about the positions as a GM. I only think there were really GM positions at that time. Not at least not a lot of them. There weren't even technical director at that time. The head coach, much like over in Europe, the head coach was sort of the GM and head coach, sort of that dual role. Whereas I think that's one of the largest shifts over the past 5-10 years has been the evolution of the role in the front office.
Well, you were a good player in your own right, and anyone that was up at the training ground in Toronto and these pickup games, they know that you can play, Tim. I mean, you played university football at the University of Richmond. You went on and played in the USL as well with the Pittsburgh Riverhounds. At what point did you shift and say, you know what, I'm good, but maybe I'm not good enough to make it to MLS, and that you're thinking about other avenues that you can go down to remain in the game?
The dream was never, unfortunately, it was just the nature of where we were at as a league, and it was never really to be a professional soccer player. I mean, obviously I would have loved to have done that. I was good, but I wasn't one of the best. I was, in that class with sort of Landon Donovan, DeMarcus Beasley, Kyle Beckerman, that national pool. They were training at the U.S. in Bradenton down in Florida, and I was never able to break in on sort of the regional teams. There's the Ohio ODP system, and then you make the regional team, which is all the Midwest. And I was never able to break in. I was always sort of on the fringe. So it was really about, which has also shifted, was about going, using soccer to play collegiate soccer D1, and get into a good school, and then use that to eventually get a good job. And it wasn't until at Richmond when we made it to the NCAA tournament and had an at-large bid. And I saw a couple players that were older than me make it into MLS, Craig Zadie at DC United, that I started to even think about in a serious way about playing professional. And at that point, that's when I sort of really started to dedicate myself to the craft a little more and get serious. But in a lot of ways, it was too late. And looking back now and how we evaluate players, I can say that one, I didn't have the just natural talent. So a lot of it was just hard work. I was a number sort of a 10 converted to an 8 to a 6 was probably my best position when I eventually got to the Pittsburgh Riverhounds, because I was relying on the work rate rather than being, especially what Greg Vanny or it would say, the intelligent player who's reading the game. Because frankly, I don't think I was really taught that way. I think the coaching it wasn't at the level it is now. I don't think the tactics were elevated, and I don't think it necessarily had the champions that coaches provide now to players to provide them confidence, to provide them a pathway to the pros at an early age. And so the game's just shifted so much, and I feel like our young players right now are very fortunate to have all of the training grounds at their disposal, the federations, resources, all the tournaments, the Olympics, and all these things that lead to the World Cup. So to qualifying in the World Cup. So it's again, it's just changed so much.
It's interesting you say that, because there's footballing intelligence, and then there's, you're clearly a smart guy, Tim. You're balancing playing professionally with the Riverhounds in USL as well as pursuing your law degree at the same time. So, I mean, that had to be a challenge in its own right. You're trying to still fight for yourself, your teammates on the field, but you're also pursuing another path as well. Maybe walk us through that, what that looked like, and how you managed to kind of juggle both and inevitably go down one path that led to all kinds of success for you.
Yeah. So the USL at that time had just divided. They had consolidated the NASL, I believe. There were sort of two divisions, and they merged together and created sort of a USL Pro League. And there was no relationship between MLS and USL at the time. There was no, right now there's a feeder system. There's a sort of a minor league, sort of like in minor league baseball where you call in players. There was no connection. It was, in fact, the opposite. When I started at Pittsburgh, we was only a year and a half removed from the contraction of Major League Soccer, where the Tampa Bay Mutiny and the Miami Fusion had folded. So if you think about it, that's at that time rosters, I think, were approximately 20 players, not 30 like they are now. But those 20 players, 40 between the two teams, were dispersed amongst all the MLS teams. So it was even more challenging, more difficult to break into the league. And not that I, again, like I said, I was more hopeful than sort of expected. The draft class, I think there were only 4 rounds and there were only 10 teams. And so what is that, 40 players? And I was on the draft list. There's only 70 players in the draft list. And I was one of the 10 or 20 that went undrafted. And it is what it is. It's funny. If you go back, you can find the draft list. And Michael Bradley was that draft. I blame Michael. He was a 3rd round pick that jumped ahead of me. Freddie Adu was that draft. I think Chad Marshall might have been, but it was a great draft, and I got pushed out.
I've never heard of any of those guys, Tim.
Yeah,
not familiar.
You might have heard a few of these guys, but in Pittsburgh, it's just it was a different time. The pay was very little, and obviously we had apartments. The whole team lived together in the same apartment complex. It wasn't extremely professional in a way that you could. You trained every day, obviously, but there were just little things that are just so different now. But I think the main difference was that you probably knew that you were not going to make MLS once you were in this league. And I felt like right when I got in, I didn't want to play until I was 30, 31, 32, and then start a career after. So I immediately started studying for law school. in something during the second year that I was playing, and I realized that when my focus wasn't entirely on soccer, actually my play dropped. My focus dropped, and I remember not starting in the second year as I started getting accepted into law school because my focus wasn't there. And I think it's something I told our players at TFC2 and certainly our young players in our academy here in Columbus is the difference of when soccer is your livelihood and what it means to players who it is their goal in life to do this versus some players who have a lot of options, which is good for, if I were a parent, I would be saying it's great to have options to go to school. But at times you see the drive might be a little bit less. The focus might be a little bit less for a player who maybe comes from a well-to-do background or economic situation compared to someone who's focused, who sort of sees this as his path and his calling.
Well,
and I feel like for me, it really at that point wasn't. It was about sort of an experience, much like some people take gap years, and it was, hey, this is sort of a stopgap before I start my real career.
well, a decent stopgap at that, and options did present themselves because in 2010 you joined Major League Soccer's headquarters, and I want to get this title right because it seems very established for such a young man. You were 28, 29 years old at the time, Senior Director of Player Relations and Competition. I know that means that you dealt with contracts, development initiatives, player initiatives, but how did you link up with MLS and how did that role came about for such a young guy, relatively speaking, in terms of a lot of established people within the industry?
And that's the question I get all the time. And what happened was in law school, my purpose of going to law school was to get in soccer in another capacity, or eventually maybe an athletic director at a university or college. But it was really is this league and seeing how it was going to grow is positioning yourself to possibly maybe work in the league someday at that point. And what happened was in law school, I actually wrote an article on the Beckham rule, which the DP rule, and was on the law school sort of editing group and got published and sort of that sort of led toward me studying the league's economic structure, the legal structure, and that helped me get a position in an antitrust law. I'm getting into the weeds here, but in Virginia, the Attorney General's office and in the antitrust division, because law only sort of crosses over into sports in a few ways directly. And antitrust is one of those ways. Obviously, contracts is another.
Sure.
And then that position, that first year, that summer, landed me a position in a law firm called Sherman and Sterling in their London office and then their New York office. And Sherman Sterling is a sort of one of the old school Wall Street law firms, and they represent Manchester City. And that's sort of when I started to see the intersection between law and professional soccer. And one of the last things I did in that law firm was actually incorporate Manchester City's Soccer in the City initiative, which is across all the United States in New York City, which was it was sort of their canary in the coal mine, perhaps, of what them investing in Major League Soccer with New York City FC. And at that time, this was in this is in 2009 in New York City. The league office, which was only 10 blocks south in Manhattan from my law firm, they posted a position where they were looking for a professional soccer player who happened to be a lawyer. And in the United States, by all counts now, I realized that there's probably only about 5 of us at the time. Gareth Lagerway, who already had a position. And there was a few others. That one was a teacher. I knew he wasn't going to be in the mix for that position. So I tell people all the time, obviously setting yourself up to be in the right place at the right time. But there obviously is a certain amount of luck too, right? That comes into when that was posted. I was in the right position at the right time, and it was the same subway stop that I got off when I switched firms to Major League Soccer right by Bryant Park on Fifth Avenue.
But before we get into your days as general manager, I mean, you mentioned it. You wrote your paper on David Beckham coming to the league, and obviously that changed kind of the way that contracts work. And now we're in a situation where there's a lot of complexities around league rules. What did you learn at that time, and how much was an advantage taking your day-to-day job within Major League Soccer and applying it to what turned out to be very useful, being a general manager in Major League Soccer.
Yeah, I tell people all the time that the league office is a great sort of breeding ground for executives at the local level, because what the league office you're able to see is not only the day to day what clubs are doing, and clubs are designed to win on Saturday in their in the matches and the games, and then clearly is to generate revenue with their fan and their content. But at the league level, you're thinking in sort of 3, 5, 10-year terms. And so to be sort of mentored by Todd Durbin, who's an EVP at the league office, was a tremendous opportunity. But to also, he brought myself and Ollie Curtis, who's at Toronto FC now, into the room. We were doing some of the back work for the owners in their strategic planning sessions. So, for example, the league has a mission to be among the best leagues in the world by at the time it was 2022, because we thought we had a chance of making the World Cup, or of hosting the World Cup before the bid. But all of the meetings that took place in what was then the competition committee with the likes of various owners, we were doing some of the back work, the grunt work, to the research behind a lot of the decks. So that's what you get to see at the league office. And then on top of that, the sheer number of contracts you got to negotiate. At that time, like I said, there weren't not that many technical directors or GMs even doing this work at the league office. So, for example, in Houston was one of my teams. Dom Kinnear was the coach, and Chris Canetti was the president. They had Dom was their de facto GM, so we had a standing call every morning where on the way into work they would call me and we would talk about their player contracts, and then I would call the agent and negotiate those. So there was a lot of situations like that. Chivas, for example, was one of my teams, USA, where you were actually the GM doing the work, a lot of the player work for them. So it was through this experience, and then watching certain teams do it well, and a lot of teams do it not so well, where you started to plant the seed of like, look, when the opportunity's there, perhaps I could do this. I feel like it's so clear in some situations what the right decision or the correct decision is, but so often because of the pressures of our industry and our sport that you don't for whatever reason you don't make the right decision or the correct decision.
It's the perfect transition really to Toronto FC at that time, because before you joined as general manager in 2013, the team's overall record since 2007, the birth of the club, 49, 102, and 66. I mean, what was your impression in New York at that time about what was happening and the inability to find success?
Complicated. It was just watching it was extremely frustrating, because you saw the success in the state with the stadium and the community, and on the business side, every meeting that we would go to at the league office, that we would use obviously the materials of the Red Patch Boys or whomever was in the at BMO Field at the time. Sort of all that material is being used on the business side to showcase what this new MLS was, and they were the first club. I don't care what people say in Seattle. Clearly, they took a page out of Toronto's book.
Sure.
To really take it to a new level, and then Atlanta and so on and so forth. And so that's what was so frustrating of watching Toronto. I would say after having moved there, you sort of understand why, because the European nature. This is my opinion. This is personal opinion. Is the pressures in a big market, and people in the U.S. don't necessarily understand the pressures in a Toronto, like the people like the Canadians and the people who live in Toronto, but the European influence and how the football culture is very sort of European based. That if you don't get results after 2, 3, 4 games, people start to ask questions, and that's not something that happens in Major League Soccer. It hadn't happened really again until 5 years, and I'd say Toronto is probably one of the first teams to lead that, because there's so many of the coaching changes. And so the coverage, I think the 4 or 5 papers that were covering the team on a daily basis, and the blogs and the TV, the national TV, there was just so much attention on the players that I think ownership, if whether or not they realized it or not, but were maybe making decisions a little bit too hasty at certain times and not giving the coach or the GM more time to let it ride out.
Well, the game changer came in 2013 with the hire of Tim One or Big Tim, whatever you want to, Tim Leiweke, and then just a few months later, he brought you on board. Do you ask yourself why you? Like why you are the right guy? Did you have a relationship with Leiweke before?
Yeah, not directly with Tim Leiweke. But the experience came from the work at the league office and the connection I had with some of the owners. There had been some overtures from other teams before, just from the work that our office had done and the familiarity that we had with the cap at the time. But Tim had moved to MLSE, and he again, this is an opportunity where I was at the right place at the right time in some ways, because I think he reached out, from what I hear, he's reached out to the commissioner and directly to Todd Durbin, and he's really looking for a young executive. I think you can see that there's various times where he's hired young executives, um, and 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 I think he asked their opinion about whether or not there was someone who could come in and do the things that I was at least good at the time, or probably lended itself to my strengths, coming from the player relations and competition. And in some ways, Tim L and I, we complemented each other, because he was in a way a de facto president of the team, right?
Sure.
So he was the CEO of MLSE, but he also gave me enough space to become a general manager, but probably even do a little bit more. But then when the big items came along, DP signings, or even big trades, we would really put our heads together with the coach and make decisions collectively. So Tim L was, obviously recruited me. He is the reason I was able to go to Toronto. And yeah, it was, it was an opportunity that I seized. I think that there were a lot of people I even spoke to when it was offered that said, don't take it because you're going to be fired in months or 12 months if you're lucky. At that time, Kevin Payne is still revered as one of the leaders and founders of the game and the professional game, certainly in our country, and a highly respected individual who I knew well. So there were a lot of reasons why I should not have taken the position, but there were, on the flip side, there were so many reasons to take it because the opportunity was profound. It was incredible that whoever was able to take this club and create a solid foundation, the opportunity to turn it around would obviously be something that's memorable, and obviously, for a lot of, there were a lot of ups and downs getting there, but we were able to achieve that, and really thankful for Larry Tannenbaum for their support, the board. I think MLSE, their board, gets a lot of obviously a lot of praise, but a lot of, sometimes they get targeted. And what I would say is there are a few places in this continent where you can get the support that you get from an MLSE, where they hire professionals and they give them the support and they allow them to do their jobs, and then you get evaluated on wins and losses, and that's really all you can ask of a leadership group is judge us by the wins and losses, which is what we're brought here to do.
Well, and look, there was great change, but it was necessary at the time. And some of the big names you bring in, even to this day, Tim, it just, sometimes you're like, wow, I saw that player play in Toronto. Julio Cesar was the first one. I mean, bringing over a goalkeeper who was going to be playing in a home World Cup in the months following. I mean, that was a big acquisition. Then Defoe and Bradley came along. I mean, you hit the ground running, Tim. Like, what do you remember about that time and kind of the big name hunting, but making sure that they're surrounded with a cast that could obviously also achieve success?
Yeah, what I remember about that time was thinking that I'm not going to last more than a month or two. Not
Really?
first, am I going to get fired? But two, just the sheer pace at which Tim Leiweke can work it's for a person of his age is incredible. I mean, he all hours calling, and we're creating plans because we needed to turn over the roster with Ryan Nelson, and Ryan, to his credit, was working extremely hard. He was really well connected, and that was an example where the three of us were really complementary because Tim was a big thinker, and really supported us to shoot for the moon. Ryan obviously was well connected, and then I was sort of the person at that time who was in charge of sort of making sure it all worked from a mechanics, from the contract standpoint, from the league rules. And so the three of us, we went on this mission and these trips over to Europe, where we met, Frank Lampard and the Defoes and the Bianchis and various players that we were looking for to fill that number 9 role, or we were actually looking for two strikers at the time. But what I remember about that time was how quickly we were moving. It was such a fast pace, and we needed to get all our ducks in a row and create strong pitches, right, to attract the talent to the market. But I also remember how something had changed too in the world market, where people, especially in a city like Toronto, were recognizing MLS, starting to recognize MLS, and they would be. Whereas before, when I was at the league office, I would say once every few months, someone would call, an agent from a player who was in his 30s would call, being interested in the league. Whereas I feel like once I moved to Toronto, we were on our pitches. You could set up a meeting with any agent, any player. I don't care who they were; they would at least listen. Especially when you had someone like Tim Leiweke, who everyone knew had brought David Beckham over to Major League Soccer.
Right.
And so that was massive. That was massive.
Well, what's incredible is it was dubbed the bloody big deal at the time. Defoe and Bradley came over, but it's actually what Defoe turned into that's actually probably more complicated, and which inevitably brought the team that MLS Cup. Doing a swap deal, player for player, essentially, there might be more to it, Tim, but Altidore for Defoe, I mean, that's something that you just don't see in the game today, typically player swaps. Just how complicated is making a deal like that, and how convinced were you that you were doing the right thing at that time?
I think we knew we were doing the right thing because we knew the player wanted out, right? And he had expressed an interest even earlier in the summer, and we felt like we were in a position maybe still to make the playoffs at that point, in 14, to do it. And so we wanted to hold tight. Plus, we had invested quite a bit, right, in Defoe. So at that point, we felt like, let's give it a chance. We had just recently we had switched coaches at that time, and so we wanted Greg to have the opportunity to see what we could do with Jermaine. But the bloody big, just to go back, the bloody big deal was still to this day one of the most remarkable marketing campaigns I've ever seen or been a part of. I mean, the big red bus. We flew over to London to tape parts of that. Shannon Hosford and David Freeman at MLSE deserve all the plaudits for this incredible campaign. But as one board member, it became, the bloody big mess is unfortunately what it turned out to be. But we learned so much from that, and so I will never look back and say it was a mistake. I think that's the lesson in football, is that you're never going to get them all right, no matter how good the player is. But the one thing I learned is that the player has to really desire to be a part of that club and in that city. You can't oversell a project to him. You can't, at some level, you have to meet 50-50 at midway, or maybe not midway, even 75-25, and say, hey, this is as far as we can go. You need to do the heavy lifting in this way, or else this isn't going to work. And you got to give it to them straight, right up front at the beginning, and show them how hard, and tell them how hard it's going to be, the travel, the lifestyle. It's just different. So, and then to your point about flipping it for Defoe, I mean, for Altidore, for Josie, that extremely complicated. We were able to utilize the league office quite a bit in that, because Josie is supposed to come in through the allocation ranking system. But there were two clubs who felt it was a win-win for both of them, and the players were both in a position where they wanted to leave. And so, fortunately, in the footballing world, there's always players who are unhappy with their situation. That's inevitable, and and so when that situation exists, then the question is, can you establish trust between the front offices and the ownership groups, where you feel like you can get a deal done? And I feel like that was, again, where we relied on the agents and the league office, and we got on the phone and worked out a deal to do it right. And luckily we were able to get it over the line.
Very well, and it was a club transformation that really came out of that move and where it led. You're a pro, Tim, because you're asking questions. Mike was wondering, what did you learn from the Defoe situation. You explained it perfectly right there, which you probably apply now because now being in Columbus, you're dealing with a different set of circumstances. You kind of talked about it. They're different markets, different places. So do you use that technique? How much do you use that technique in your pursuit of players? Because you're not pitching Toronto, you're pitching Columbus, which are different in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take pieces of it. What I learned during this first few years and the mistakes that we made, and then how we made up for them with Josie and Giovinco, and obviously Michael coming in, is it provided a playbook or a blueprint that I use to this day. There's a lot of the things that I learned at that time that I use for every single one of my signings, and certainly even Giovinco was one where sort of had to learn and do it with our group that we and the soccer operations staff without Tim or at that time, obviously we had switched coaches, but it was our group that was able to go and do that. And so we had to take what we learned from the first signings to go and apply that to acquire Giovinco. And then now in Columbus, you're right, we're in a different situation, but I think the same rules still apply, but we also have to understand the values of this market, and they're going to be different than the values of not just the fans, but the city as a whole, and what types of players will resonate for this coach and for this system and in this market. But a lot of the mechanics are the same. The timelines are the same in terms of how you approach windows and the recruitment timelines and the need to do the dirty work 6, 12, 18 months in advance. And then the same that mistake for Defoe, the lesson learned still applies, which is we need people who want to be here and want to be in Columbus for what Columbus is. And so it's a little bit more of a challenge because we have to educate more people on who Columbus is and what we're about here. Not just the club, but the city, because it's not as well known as Toronto. That's just a fact. But we have to be aware of that fact. That's our situation, and turn it into a strength. And what we find is once people actually learn about Columbus and dig in deeper, they fall in love with it. And what you find is a lot of our former players in Columbus always try to come back and play for the Crew. It's amazing how many people, once I became president GM here, how many former players either want to work or move their family back here because they love this club. And obviously there are 20 years of history here because we're the first club in Major League Soccer. So there's a lot more of those players than in Toronto, right? Sure. When I came in 2013, the club had only been around for 7-8 years. And so there wasn't this affinity from all the past alumni like there is in Columbus, where you have an alumni event, you're having hundreds of players coming back.
Amazing. We have some Crew questions coming in. Those are coming up in just about 5-10 minutes, but there's two other Toronto FC things that are very important that we need to touch on. You've told the story before, your recruitment of Sebastian Giovinco, arguably, in some people's eyes, the best player to ever play in Major League Soccer. I mean, this guy's in his prime, Tim. This was about international headlines, just not North American headlines. An Italian team player playing for Juventus. How did that come about? Like, what tips you off that a player like Giovinco may be available? And at what point did you realize, you know what, we have a real shot of bringing him to MLS?
Yeah, it's you know, I've, some of the audience have probably heard this story, but you know, we approached that window, the winter window of between 2014 and 2015, just like we would any others, right? We knew we needed a DP, and I was, you know, at that point again, Tim Leiweke had already announced he was leaving, and so there was some rumblings and some thought at that time of ownership of, you know, how do we replace him? Does there need to be a president of TFC at that time? Because he was leaving and he was sort of de facto president. And so the acquisition of Giovinco was in some ways our ability as a group, myself, Greg, Corey Ray, Jack Dodd, to prove that we could go and acquire a player of the caliber that would be successful in Major League Soccer, right? So, and that was sort of our A bucket, right? Are these list of players that would be probably high profile and bigger budget players. And then we had our list of B players and C players, or whatever you want to call them, top, you know, high tier, mid tier, low tier. It's not rocket science here, right? There are players and there's a certain budget, a transfer fee, and a salary that are going to fit in these buckets. And Giovinco from the very beginning was identified as a player who was coming out of contract by in the summer of 15. And so Jack Dodd, I remember at the time it was in all of our scouting meetings, we were looking for a number 10 clearly. Myself and Greg and our group had identified that position as one of need. And what happened was we had already seen him live a couple of times through our trips. At least our Jack had seen him a couple of times live. But I also knew it was going to be a long shot, right? It was one of those where he's playing for the Italian national team. He's playing for Juventus. Yes, he's not starting, but he's still scoring, and he's playing in Champions League at that time. I think he had scored a good goal against Fiorentina at the time, and so it was like, look, it's going to be a long shot, but we're like, look, let's never rule it out. You never know. And what happened was, so we were always pursuing him, but we always had our sort of, I'm a pragmatist, right? And I'm like, okay, I know who's going to be very difficult, but we got to shoot for the moon and we never stop. But there's all these other players that I was kind of pressing on. And Jack and Corey went on there's these various scouting conferences and places, locations where it brings clubs around the world. It's one of them is called Y Scout, and it was in London. And at that time, you get a table as a club, and then you interact with other clubs to maybe strike deals. It's sort of like speed dating for the world of football and soccer clubs and agents. And at that point, Jack and Corey ran into, or in some ways by happenstance, but I think in some ways by fate, right? That Giovinco's agent was there. Andrea D'Amico was there, and he met with Jack and Corey. And so on that week's scouting call, they called and they said, look, there's always you scout the player, and then you have to make contact with the right party. And a lot of times you don't know who is the real agent. So there's a lot of people who pretend to be players' agents, and they'll try to strike up and create a deal. And then what they'll do, they reverse engineer a deal. So they'll say, yes, I am the agent of Giovinco. Here's what the player will cost. And then the agent will go to the player and say, hey, I have an offer from Columbus, sign with me. So it is the wild, wild west out there. And so one of the hardest parts is finding the right person who actually has the ear of the agent and is the player's agent. It's crazy, right? And so Andrea D'Amico connected with Corey and Jack. They called me. I didn't believe it at first. I'm like, this guy's probably not his agent. Have him call me. And I remember this was probably, I think it was the Christmas break in 2014. And this Italian accent calls me, and this guy with the Italian accent calls me, Andrea D'Amico. And then he clearly knew what he was talking about. He had a number of high profile players, and he could talk about them in a way that sounded authentic. So then I said, okay, I'll book a flight over to Torino, flying into Milan. I think it was a January 2nd or 3rd in 2015, and flew over, and I was literally there for 24 hours. And I flew in, and Andrea picked me up in his, if you ever envision whatever, a car that a super agent should drive, a sports car, low riding, that goes to 0 to 60 and, in 3 seconds or 2 seconds. That's exactly what it was. He had this trench coat, long beard. He looked like, what is the lead singer of Kiss's name?
Gene Simmons.
He looked like a beautiful young Gene Simmons, and I always joked, he walked into the lobby and he just, it was fate. So got into his car, we drove to Torino, and just, it was, you meet in Italian players, you typically meet in a restaurant, as you would expect it. It's almost cliche, but all Italian players have their restaurant that they're cared for and taken care of, and so I met Giovinco and his family, and Andrea, and actually Andrea's their group of agents, and we struck it off. And right from the bat, you could see how clever and smart Seba was. He was a player who thinks beyond the current time. Sure. He's a family person and one of good values, and so right away I knew that we needed to throw all our chips in and go at this one. And I remember calling Tim Leiweke after that meeting and say, hey, have you heard of this little Italian magician, the Atomic Ant? And he right, knowing the Italian audience in Toronto, we quickly started having our ticketing group sort of figure out if there would be an impact on the business side for someone like this, and you start to think through all of the things of how this could be a player that could help transform the club.
Worth every penny. It's funny, even when Giovinco came that first season, that just wasn't enough. I remember I was there. The final two games of 2015, the loss against the Montreal Impact meant that you have to go back there on the Wednesday. You end up losing that game 3-0. And there was, covering the team at the time, Tim, I was thinking, are they going to blow this up? Are they going to keep this leadership team together? Cooler heads prevailed. It did. And then just this incredible run ensued after. What stands out to you the most? We don't have time to go through each and every moment, but I mean, there was the Eastern Conference Final against Montreal the year that you lost in penalties, the MLS Cup win itself, the CONCACAF Champions League run. Like, when you look back on that time, what sticks with you about it?
I would say that the way that the leadership came together, including players like Michael Bradley and Josie and Seba, in terms of we didn't the fact that we didn't need to blow it up, right? And I think that going back to what the market in Toronto sort of calls for and what people ask for, I think cooler heads prevailed, as you said, and we knew that, but it was great to have Bill Manning came on at that time, and he also understood the value of consistency and the competitive advantage that you get if you have a consistent roster and that if you have a consistent leadership group that, especially in a league like ours. And so it became more about doubling down and understanding in terms of our roster and then understanding who we were and our weaknesses. And we knew that we needed to improve our defense. And give up fewer goals. I think we gave up 58 at that year, 58 or 59. And
yeah, you went 58-37 one season.
Right. And so what that was our identity and how we were going to reshape our identity as a team to be not just an attacking team, but also one that could control the game with possession, which was our first defense, but then also have people that had experience to keep the ball out of the back of the net. And I would also say that we went through a cultural transformation that offseason. We were very deliberate in our goal setting. Mike Roboska and Greg Vanny and we got the team together in preseason, and we were very deliberate in the way and the goals and our identity of who we wanted to be, and we actually put them down on paper, and it's stuff that you hear about all the time, but you don't always hear about it in professional teams, in the way that this team committed to that vision and the dialogue and debate and amongst the players to come to a consensus on what those were, and the arguments that took place, and players calling each other out, and sort of this storming period to get to this identity. And then clearly then the leadership, that what I think about is the leadership from that whole season to say we are going to do something great and to commit to that vision and to show persistence and resilience through various challenges.
It was an incredible run. Any regrets out of it? Whether it be a move that you make or you didn't make, or anything come to mind?
No, absolutely no regrets. You bring up the finals, the conference finals against Montreal, still to this day is the most epic finals or epic sort of two series, home and away. I think in MLS history. Obviously, I'm biased. But it just had everything. And so I would say the only regret is maybe not taking more pictures of that moment, because that was, I remember sitting down a couple, thinking before the game when they hadn't painted their lines correctly, sitting in a historic stadium that should never host an MLS game ever again.
Right.
With the turf that you can pick up, from each corner.
They had the Women's World Cup games there as well. Can you believe it?
It is abomination for in terms of surfaces, but provides a great atmosphere for fans and for a game that will live, forever and obviously TFC fans' hearts.
It was incredible. So this incredible job, you're close to where you grew up, comes available. They want you to be president and general manager of Columbus Crew. You said earlier that some people were telling you, don't take the Toronto job. Was anyone telling you not to take the Columbus job? And what was that inevitable tie that brought you back home?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say there wasn't anyone saying don't take it. I think once they knew that I was from there, I think people understood, because it's very rare that you have an opportunity to do that in professional sports. So, but I think there was certainly some questions in terms of going from literally the highest spending team in the league to the least spending team. I mean, I remember my very first draft in last year. I guess it was last year, 16, 15, 16 months ago, when in December, in January, I guess it was January, and they showed the chart of spending that the commissioner shows this in this league address, and Toronto is at one end and Columbus is at the other end. So I think other GMs kind of questioned, people aspire to go to the big market teams with more resources. But the one thing that they didn't necessarily know was the vision that the Haslam family has for this market, and the fact that they don't want to be the least spending team or the lowest spending team. They want to be competitive, and they're extremely competitive people. And there are examples like a Kansas City, a Portland's, and Montreal's who have spent significant amounts, but not maybe in the top five. But that in our league, with our rules and the competitive parity and the salary cap, you can still have success in our league, and you can still be consistent contenders. And in some ways, that was an appealing challenge for me, right? With sort of having a background with salary cap at the league office, I knew that there are various levers that you can pull and utilize to take a team that is on the low end of spending or mid tier and take them to a championship. That's a different project for me. And then you add on on top of that, the opportunity to be involved on the business side, in my home market, and connect with the business community and the community at large, soccer clubs that I played for or played against, schools. It just was a different, I feel like once in a lifetime opportunity that I had to at least explore. And I think I really, obviously thank Bill Manning and Larry Tannenbaum and the board for allowing that to happen. I'm forever grateful to them for that, because at the time I was under contract.
And now you have this young emerging team. It stands out that you say the lowest spending because, look, Nagby, Zardes, Villanueva, Mensa, a record signing, Ryan. Like, this is a young team full of talent. I'm not just saying because you're here. I predicted the Columbus Crew this season, if we were having one right now, to go on and compete right at the top of the Eastern Conference. You've made a lot of changes, kind of like you did in Toronto, relatively quickly. Is it a case of knowing what you want and going out and just getting it? Like, how did you go about making some sweeping changes that have put this team in very good stead?
Well, it's still work in progress. I think in Toronto we made changes quickly, like right from the start, with first Ryan and Tim and myself, and then with Greg, with each coach. Here was different because Caleb Porter and myself were literally hired a couple weeks before preseason started, and so the team we inherited a good roster, a quality roster, solid roster from Greg Berhalter. Obviously, he was not let go. He was promoted in some ways to the national team. So we knew we had a team with a solid core. The question was whether or not it would translate to the style of football we wanted to play under Coach Porter, and sort of and what was gonna be the hangover, if any, with this ordeal that the entire market and the players went through for this save the crew period. And we just didn't have the scouting network and set up, and the players in the crew system. It's not like you can just take everything you're doing in Toronto and replicate it overnight. So the formula was going to be, let's let last year play out. Obviously, we didn't have the greatest year. That was, we think it was clearly was impacted by ACL injuries to two deep for us. But that happens, and we didn't have the year that we would have liked. But then this year, in this off season, or at least starting with the summer window last year, in this off season, we were able to start to create a roster that was in Caleb's image and the football that we want to play. Starting with obviously Darlington Nagbe, who he has roots with. Caleb has roots with both at University of Akron and Portland, where they won championships, and then he also won championships at Atlanta. So he's a winner. It's always great to find winners and someone who has the ability to dictate the tempo, much like a Michael Bradley or Victor Vasquez, who can dictate the tempo. Darlington Nagbe can dictate the tempo for our team, along with Archer. And then getting our number 10 in Zelerion, we lost Higuain, who was sort of the face of the club in many ways. So getting Lucas Del Rion was another step forward to getting Giassi more service and getting Giassi in better positions to score, and really to help support Pedro Santos out on the wing, who had a great year.
Great year last year, yeah.
But he's probably not the number 10 that we're looking for, at least game in, game out. We know that he can play it, but that's what happened. So the transition was a little bit delayed, which is gonna happen sometimes.
We have under 5 minutes left. Stella Ryan, by the way, looks the real article match winner, first game against New York City. Not a bad way to start your MLS career. But you mentioned the Save the Crew campaign. Obviously, we're linked to a move to Austin for quite some time. That was put to an end, and it's culminated in this new stadium project downtown. And a lot has been said, Tim, over the years across Major League Soccer about MLS 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Does the Save the Crew campaign, the momentum behind that, the direction where the team's going, and now a downtown stadium, does this kind of create a Columbus Crew 2.0? Are we seeing like the new era of Crew football?
Yeah, I think you could say that. I think Columbus was the first club, Major League Soccer, when they gave out charter member. It was the charter member because of the deposits that it had, which is incredible for the market our size. Growing to almost 2 million people. People don't realize how large a market it is. But people, because it was the first soccer-specific stadium as well, people think that Montfray Stadium is a great, locally almost, they still think it's this great stadium. What they don't realize is MLS has really moved past that type of stadium. I would say BMO Field before the renovations with the roof and the premium spaces and what fans expect, not just the supporters groups, but maybe people who want a little high profile, more of a premium experience. And
downtown too. Downtown's a big deal.
Downtown. So what the Crew has now is with the last area along the river downtown is building a $300 million stadium with a mixed use development all around it on the river, it's going to be one of the best in Major League Soccer, if not the best. I mean, we had the opportunity to visit LAFC in Atlanta and take the best aspects of those stadiums, and ownership who's pushing the boundaries on what this stadium can be. And I think the renderings are fantastic, and what our premium spaces can be. Our Tunnel Club, we had the opportunity to say, hey, what do they have at BMO Field? Okay, what do they have in LA and Atlanta? Okay, how do we take it to the next level? And that's what this opportunity is. We're also people don't even know, we're turning our current stadium into a new training ground, $30 million, $35 million training ground. So we can take the first soccer specific stadium and be the first club to turn that into a community asset. That's not only our training ground that'll look similar, it'll be like our BMO training ground that Toronto has, but it's also going to be a community and a resource to develop and grow the game, and provide access for various community groups, which is part of the project in and of itself. So it's so exciting in many ways. Obviously, it would have been great if Columbus had the previous ownership had done it sooner and earlier, but then again, I would say that I wouldn't be necessarily part of that project. So
now you get to be part of it, and it sounds incredible. Tim, I have two questions from viewers here tonight. Jonathan asking, obviously another team in Ohio now with FC Cincinnati. I mean, does that help Columbus?
Massively. It helps us massively because the growth of this league is one of the things we talk about the league office is rivalries, right? The importance of rivalries, and just look at the 401 Derby in Montreal and
El Tráfico and in New York, Red Bulls. Yeah. Yes.
Look in Europe, right? I mean, it's Everton, Liverpool. I mean, just that's what the fans want, and the fact that they're an hour and a half away. I mean, 90 miles. It is an incredible. It's an incredible thing that will happen, and there's not the hate now. Although our back and forth in our 2-game series last year will obviously probably create the animosities that's needed because it's. But what's interesting is that Ohioans are very close. as a state. I think every state has its own identity. So it's interesting that the people from Columbus are going to be pitted against the people from Cincinnati, because traditionally it's been Cleveland and Cincinnati from the Bengals, Browns, Indians, Reds. And so there's this odd dynamic where a number of people in Cincinnati were Crew fans. So allegiances have been tested, but the Hell is Real name for the Derby is I think the best in sports. There's actually a billboard on the highway between the two cities that is, for whatever reason, someone who owns the land is clearly a believer, biblical, always referring to various verses, and there's a number of them, and one of them is "Hell is Real," and so
Very cool.
that was natural. The supporters choose the names, and it's a pretty neat name, if you ask me.
Bez, you just need to start it. Joe Burrow is going to be a bust campaign, and then that's how you can turn it up a little bit. And finally, Michael just wants to know, good way to end on this: how much do you miss Toronto?
I in so many ways I do. Obviously I feel very fortunate to come back to Columbus, and it's a great city, and it's in all of its ways that we know and love. But Toronto will always have a place in our hearts. And actually, this is artwork that was given. This is a neighborhood. You've probably seen this. This is Witchwood, which is the initial neighborhood that we lived in.
Cool.
Near Witchwood Barns, and so. Our daughter was born in Bloor West Village, which is the neighborhood that near Hyde Park. So there's a place in our hearts always for the city and the country. So we miss it tremendously. There's so many. The food in particular is probably the food and Wheeler's outfits are probably the top of the list. But our friends, obviously, the people are so friendly, as you know, and the bonds that we established both on the soccer side at the club and in our neighborhood and our kids' friends are what we miss most.
Awesome. We're thrilled for you. The work that you're doing down in Columbus, you're missed up here north of the border as well. You're home away from home, Tim, now, and we wish you nothing but success moving forward as well. Thank you so much for doing this. You've always been open and engaging, and I hope that our viewers enjoyed this and learned something tonight as well. Thank you so much, Tim.
Well, thanks for having me, Wheels. And it is only a drive away. So when we play our matches, TFC fans have always done well to come down on bus loads. I think there was a patchy time in the past where there was maybe some confrontation, but I welcome all fans to come when we play each other again in the future. And I'm looking forward to visiting.
And you got a great new nickname as well, Bez the Prez. Put that on your business card as well. Thank you so much. Tim Bezbatchenko, President and General Manager of the Columbus Crew. Coming up right now on our alternative feed, I should say, a replay, Canada, Cuba, CONCACAF Nations League action. A lot of goals are coming up. You're going to be able to enjoy that just in a few moments' time. And Thursday night right here on Inside the Game, I go one-on-one with Vancouver Whitecaps head coach Mark DeSantos. So looking forward to that as well. I want to thank David. I want to thank Kurt. I want to thank Armin as well, and all of you for tuning in. I am Gareth Wheeler. This has been Inside the Game, and stay home and stay safe, Canada.